Welcome back to Small Caps, ladies and gentlemen. Kerry Stevenson once again, bringing you David Breeze. He's the Executive Chairman of BPH Energy. The reason that I asked David to come on today is because most of you will know that the east coast of Australia is in an energy crisis. The last time I spoke with David, he actually, which was about a year ago, he said there is a looming energy crisis. Well, that crisis is now here. And David, through BPH Energy, has got some really interesting projects which potentially could help not only the energy crisis, but as we all know, everybody wants to have energy at reasonable prices, which they're not at the moment. Now, BPH Energy is a 36% holder in Advent Energy, which is an unlisted public company. David Breeze, I think I got all that right. Welcome
Yes.
back. Great to see you.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Well, David, you're one of the people that I really respect when it comes to understanding the big picture. So before we go into BPH Energy, the investment thesis and what you're doing, what's going on with the East Coast energy at the moment, and why have we got to this terrible position?
So Australia and the world are in fact in the grip of an energy supply crisis. In Australia, we're richly endowed with both gas and coal. But what has happened is there have been restraints on the development of projects, particularly by the state governments in New South Wales and Victoria. And so, in fact, you have this issue such that last month we had the government seized control of the gas supply pricing and delivery mechanism, and they prevented Snowy Hydro from operating one of their gas-fired electricity generation stations in Victoria. And in June, of course, they seized control of the energy supply network in the eastern states, and they did so because they were faced with immediate blackouts in Victoria, New South Wales, and even Queensland, despite the fact that we have this immensely rich supply of energy into those states. Now, the cost of seizing control of those networks in the first phase of that energy supply crisis in June is estimated to be as high as $1.8 billion. That $1.8 billion actually will be paid by consumers rather than...
Wow.
That's right. Because what happened is the government, when they initiated that process, quite literally had to say, you generate the electricity and we will pay the price. And so the government then charges the power distribution companies and the power generation and distribution companies, and then they pass that cost on to consumers. I'll put that costing in context.
Yeah.
The cost of changing over the electricity supply networks to rely on wind and solar in the eastern states is in the order of $10 billion. And over the longer time, it will be necessary to spend $30 billion on the fix to that energy supply grid. And now back in context, so we've just spent $1.8 billion or thereabouts and achieved nothing for it except to ensure the reliability of the energy grid into the eastern state. It's quite extraordinary in terms of a development.
So are you saying, if I get this right, that the state and federal governments have got involved in this and it's made it actually less efficient and more costly?
So it's far more costly. it is less efficient because of the restraints. Victoria has actually banned gas exploration onshore, and New South Wales has effectively done so, remembering that New South Wales only gets 5% of its gas supply from its own state resources, and 95% of its gas supply comes in from New South Wales and Victoria. And of course,
hang on. You're just talking about New South Wales. You're saying New South Wales imports 95% of its gas. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
From Queensland and Victoria?
Correct.
Right.
Through two sets of pipelines, and of course, if you will, South Australia, because we're talking about the Cooper Basin gas areas. Now, next year, or thereabouts, or closely followed after that, there will be the closure of the 5%. So, in fact, New South Wales will be entirely reliant upon gas coming in from other states. Now, the federal government has now recognised that that's an unacceptable position to be in.
Good.
You can't. There's 300,000 people rely on gas supply in New South Wales, either for manufacturing and jobs or as consumers in households.
So, given what they do, so the new government, federal government, has recognised the issue and is making things a bit like they've basically said, right, we need to solve this crisis. Are you seeing a more sensible look at the energy crisis on the East Coast?
Indeed. In Canberra today, there is a meeting of federal and state government ministers, and what they've done is they've determined that they have to fix the transition to renewables in this process. In other words, they have to have baseload power out of gas and coal whilst we transition to renewables. It's just not possible to turn off the gas-fired power stations and turn off the coal-fired power stations. In fact, yesterday, I think it was New South Wales had 60% of its electricity supplied by coal-fired power stations. And gas, of course, is recognised as having around 50 to 60% less CO2 emissions in the generation of electricity. So even Europe, who were leading the field, has now changed their viewpoint and have now included gas in the baseload power support system whilst they transition to renewables. And of course, all of this has been significantly exacerbated by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And what you're now seeing is Europe in the midst of an energy supply crisis, and gas prices and LNG prices in particular have risen strongly around the world, and there is immense demand out of Korea, China, Japan, and other Southeast Asian nations for Australia's LNG, so much so that Korea yesterday through POSCO committed to a further $1 billion of investment into the gas supply network in Australia. That's how serious the problem is, and that's the only way in which it can be fixed is to ensure that there is ongoing supply of gas to enable that transition to renewables.
That leads me quite nicely into PEP 11, which we spoke about last year. Now, you have a very large offshore project, gas project, which in the past has had some challenges in terms of getting permitting, etc. Where are you at with that? And how confident are you of that helping with this gas supply crisis?
So I'll talk briefly about PEP 11. PEP 11 is, and the project area is about 30 kilometres offshore Newcastle and southeast. That's the primary target area for supply. Contrary to what people say about it being close to the shore, in fact, it's about 25 to 30 kilometres offshore. It's a key area for future supply of gas into New South Wales. And if you look at the Kurri Kurri gas-fired power station that's being built, they're building that as a baseload power input. So PEP 11 is ideally suited. It is in fact the only offshore permit in the entire east coast seaboard, right the way from Queensland down to the gas fields of offshore Victoria. So PEP 11 was held up in a regulatory process a year ago by the former Morrison government, and we've now had to take them to the federal court, and that federal court process is underway at the moment. However, what we did in the interim was to do all of the environmental planning and long lead item process that is necessary before you go into the drilling of a well, which of course is the next step for our project offshore Baleen. And now everyone who is a consumer of energy in New South Wales needs that solution to their crisis, because rather than energy bills going down $300, they've in fact gone up probably as the order of $300 per household. In fact, if you look what occurred in the gas supply crisis in July in Victoria, and the energy supply crisis, as I outlined earlier, $1.8 billion of cost is the estimated cost of that going through to consumers. So PEP 11 is ideally positioned because it has a prospective recoverable resource estimated independently at around 5 TCF. In context, the Victorian offshore gas fields have supplied about 6 TCF into Victoria, New South Wales, and even South Australia over the last 60 years.
Wow. Okay. It's big. It's big. So let me ask you this. You said that there's a federal court procedure going on now. Given the change of government, does that still have to go ahead? Is the new government understanding that there is an energy crisis? PEP 11 is a very, very big gas field. It is, you wouldn't even be able to see it if you were standing at Bondi Beach. But it is a solution. Do you still have to go through with that federal court, or are they starting to see sense?
So because it is before the court, I can't comment on the actual court process of our case, except to say the only precedent in this area in a federal court action of this type was settled by the government before that it even got to court in a mediation process, and NOPTA, who is the regulatory authority in this instance, granted the suspension and extension. So we can look to that precedent as a possible resolution to the outcome of this case. And of course, it is always possible in the process, in fact, preferred by the courts, that these things are settled before it gets to the courts, because in that process, of course, we can complete the planning and implementation and preparation necessary for the drilling of the well in the PEP 11 at Baleen.
Okay. As an investment thesis, David, I want to understand fully what's the sort of, let's just say that the court case, it all happens and, you know, you're going to go ahead. How long would it take to get this in production? Because you mentioned a moment ago that Bass Strait, which by the way can't go on forever, has supplied about 5 TCF, and you're saying PEP 11 has got about, did you say 10?
No, 5 TCF as a prospective recoverable.
Right. So talk to me about what the process is and the lead time to get this into production. We're in a crisis.
So we're in a crisis, and when you're in a crisis with the cooperation of authorities, you can do things in a much more efficient manner. I'll give you context here. Cooper, who have a participation in the offshore Victorian gas area, were able to lay a pipeline from their last project area offshore Victoria, which is almost equidistant to our project, about 26 k's offshore. And they were able to actually lay that pipeline in a period of about 4 to 6 months. That's just the installation. The rest of the time frame that they had was taken up in the regulatory process and the procurement process. But because we are only 26 kilometres offshore, we're in a much better position to be able to rapidly implement. We're just offshore from the Munmora power station, and that can be there is a trunk pipeline that goes into the Munmora power station from the Sydney-Newcastle gas pipeline, which of course enables our gas to go down into Sydney, and conversely can be taken up into Newcastle. And we've seen the impact of the energy supply crisis in the fact that the Tomago aluminium works had to actually turn off pot lines with considerable risk during the last crisis in order to ensure that there was still continuity of energy supply. This is how serious this energy crisis has been. So in that context, it's quite possible to, with the cooperation of regulatory authorities, to bring a pipeline into shore from 26 kilometres out to sea. As you say, so far away that you can't even see it from the shoreline.
Look, David, there's a lot to talk about with PEP 11, but I also we really need to briefly touch on, you've gone into hydrogen investment. I want to know the reason for that from an investor point of view, and also talk to us about your New Zealand investment, just quickly.
So, in fact, there are 2 aspects here. We've invested in hydrogen, but the offshore PEP 11 area is also recognised by government studies as a potential carbon capture and storage. So, or rather a carbon storage area, CCS, the whole technology is called. And so, in fact, in the drilling of the well, we can simultaneously research both the supply of gas, but alternately the capacity to utilise the offshore area for a storage of carbon. And remember that New South Wales supplies, or rather produces, about 1/3 of all of Australia's carbon dioxide emissions. So having a capacity to remove that carbon and store it underground essentially for all time gives a terrific opportunity. But the hydrogen investment that we've made can also be utilised because we've invested in a project which is turquoise hydrogen.
Oh.
And the turquoise hydrogen really means that we're taking methane and turning it into hydrogen and carbon black, both of which, of course, are projects that have full support of government including, of course, the federal government, who is looking for hydrogen as a source of supply into the Kurri Kurri gas-fired power station, and indeed for the entire gas distribution and usage network in New South Wales.
David, are you saying that turquoise hydrogen will be coming out of PEP 11? Did I get that right?
No, it's a treatment process.
Okay.
For the methane. In short, you take the methane that comes out of the well,
Yep,
and you can convert it into hydrogen and carbon black.
okay.
But our investment in that hydrogen project isn't just for an application for our gas. We're talking about a global supply solution here. This technology can be used, and that's why we invested in it, in USA, in Europe, and the process, in fact, gives that treatment of methane so that you're producing the hydrogen and the carbon black without CO2 emissions. It's a perfect solution. And of course, it does so at a price which is around an estimated $2 a kilogram, as opposed to the other and most expensive methodology, which currently has an estimated cost of about $16 a kilogram for the production of hydrogen. So the group that we've invested in has very strong interest from Europe, from Japan and other Asian countries, as well as USA. In fact, its base is in the USA because that's where there is a significant recognition of the need to be able to take methane gas and convert it into hydrogen.
All right, David, we're running out of time, and I do want to get into the investment in New Zealand. This is the Taranaki Basin, offshore New Zealand. Why? What's the opportunity there?
So equally, New Zealand faces its own energy supply crisis. In fact, New Zealand actually had blackouts. New South Wales had blackouts as well, but much more minor. So New Zealand has less than 5 years worth of gas supply in its estimated resources, both onshore and offshore. New Zealand uses gas as a significant portion of its energy supply or energy production process. I think it's of the order of 30%. And so, in fact, New Zealand imports all of its oil. So New Zealand needs alternate supplies of its hydrocarbon. And in fact, in the very recent past, New Zealand actually imported over 1 million tonnes of coal to ensure it had ongoing energy, and that coal, of course, had a significant cost and of itself as well, because of where it was imported from, has a significant adverse impact on the environment. So,
and ultimately the consumer pays.
And ultimately the consumer pays. And so we've gone into a project there with the OMV, and we have a 30% interest. Now that's going itself through a regulatory process in New Zealand for the approvals of that farm out, but the project itself already has its necessary approvals. But our participation in that project is going through a New Zealand government regulatory process.
So there's lots of processes going on. Tell me what you think the investment thesis is around these. Do you think everyone's going to get terribly excited once that sort of regulatory hurdles have come through and they go, wow, we're off, you're ready?
Well, one way, in fact, which is why we have significant support, when we drilled as BPH Energy and the associated companies previously, the offshore initial well in PEP 11, the combined market capitalisation of the companies that were involved in the project went to over $400 million. In other words, the market was happy to invest on the prospectivity of the potential for that future energy supply. And so, yes, we do anticipate, just as recently our share price and the valuation of our company went from around $20 million to over $200 million until the Morrison government determined that they would seek to block the permitting process. So there is potential substantial uplift in value that can arise out of a successful project. If you think about context here of Victoria, the Victorian offshore projects were, in their energy supply, a substantial input to the development and the employment in Victoria, but also in other states, and a necessary part of the growth of the Victorian economy. And they inputted, just as Queensland does, billions of dollars into the New South Wales and federal tax input, which is of course necessary for schools and roads and development. And so, in fact, energy and hydrocarbons become a key part of the economy.
And it is a key part of the economy. David, just quickly, BPH, a part of your investment portfolio, you've invested in medtech as well through, I think it was Cortical Dynamics. What's the rationale with that?
So BPH invested at its outset in technology. We look for Australian technology that had world application, that had a significant technical advantage over the existing process, addressed billion-dollar markets on a global basis, and could be patented and developed. And that's what we did with the cortical process. It is an anaesthesia monitoring machine. It has applications across wider areas. It potentially can go into the ICU area. And we saw how important that was during the most recent phase of COVID. And of course, hospitals are looking to ensure that patients go into operations and have anaesthesia in a safe and effective way. And we've in fact now paired with international groups to further develop the technology. And the cortical device is now being trialled in hospitals in Europe and in Asia, and is receiving significant technical input, which is being taken into the way in which we're now improving and implementing that technology. And we've now taken the tech, which already had TGA and CE approval, into America, and we're going through the FDA process for the approval of the technology into the States at the moment.
Where can people find out more about what you're doing there? Is there a website they can go to find out more?
Yes, so bphenergy.com.au, and Cortical, of course, has its own website, and you can go to that link through our own website.
Okay, so yeah, because it's a lot to take in today, but I think it's very exciting. Look, David, I think the main thing that I want to get across to people is that you understand where the blockages are with this energy crisis. It's not going away. Ladies and gentlemen, PEP 11, can we please just hurry up and get it, because it will help not just New South Wales, but the whole of the east coast of Australia. It's an energy crisis that's set not to go away. We need to have governments understand that. And David, I wish you all the best. Come back and each time you're getting through some things, come back and have a chat with us again on small caps.
Kerry, thank you for your time. I appreciate that.